He came home on a Sunday. The sky was clear, the crowd was loud, and the whole town showed up to see him. Flags waved from porches, cameras flashed, and someone held a sign that said, "Welcome home, hero." Ethan Cole smiled. It looked like relief. But to anyone who really knew him, it looked like pretending. He hugged his wife, kissed her forehead, and whispered something no one could hear. Then he looked over her shoulder, not at the crowd, not at the sky, but somewhere far beyond it. They called him a survivor, but survival isn't always the same as being alive. That night, the house was quiet again. Same bed, same walls, the same woman he dreamed of coming home to, but none of it felt real. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something, maybe an order, maybe a sound that never came. Every few minutes, his eyes would dart toward the window. Headlights passing outside painted quick flashes across the wall, flashes that to him looked too familiar. He'd blink and suddenly it was Afghanistan again. The dust, the smell of burnt fuel, the radio static that always came before the worst moments. He could still hear Ramirez laughing beside him, teasing him for being too serious. He could still feel the heat on his face from the blast that took Ramirez away. And he could still taste the guilt, the kind that doesn't wash off, no matter how many times you tell yourself you did everything you could. Everyone said the same thing. "You made it home, Ethan." But in his mind, that was the problem. He made it home. Ramirez didn't. So he lived two lives, one for himself and one for the man who never got the chance. During the day, he smiled when people thanked him for his service. He said all the right things, that he was grateful, that he was lucky, that he was adjusting. But at night, he'd walk the hallway barefoot, stopping at the doorway of the guest room, the one he never entered. Inside, the light bulb was gone, but the outline of Ramirez's photo was taped to the wall. Claire, his wife, didn't know. She thought he was just restless. She told friends he was still readjusting, the way everyone does after war. But deep down, she could feel it. The distance between them wasn't measured in miles or time. It was measured in something heavier, something you can't see, but you can feel when the person you love starts slipping away. He'd sit on the porch at sunrise, gripping his coffee so tight his knuckles turned white, watching the quiet street, waiting for something he couldn't name. Once she asked what he was looking at. He said, "Just checking if it's all still here." And then he went silent again. Days turned into weeks. The town moved on. People stopped visiting, stopped calling. The parade banners were gone, the flags folded away, and the man everyone had been so proud of now barely left the house. Some nights, Claire would wake to the sound of him shouting names, coordinates, orders, and then he'd apologize, over and over, whispering into the dark, "I didn't mean to leave him there." No one else ever heard those words. No one else knew that Ethan Cole, the man everyone called a hero, couldn't forgive himself for surviving. He kept a small notebook under his bed, page after page of scribbled numbers, radio calls, dates circled in red. He never explained what they meant. But one page stood out. Written across it, in uneven handwriting, were 4 words: "I never came back." And in a way, he was right. He walked through that door, but left everything that made him human somewhere out there, in the dust, the fire, the silence. To the world, Ethan Cole came home. But to those who really looked close, he never did. This isn't a story about war. It's about what the war left behind. The kind of story people don't tell at parades. The kind you only hear when the medal stops shining and the crowd stops cheering. His name was Ethan Cole. He came home a hero. But the man that left that war never really returned. Before the war, Ethan Cole was the kind of man people trusted. the kind of man who fixed broken fences for neighbors and showed up early to church on Sundays. The son of a steel worker, raised on discipline, loyalty, and faith. At 32, he had already served 2 tours, both in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, one of the harshest landscapes on earth. To outsiders, Helmand was just another place on the map. To Ethan, it was where every sunrise carried a promise and a threat. His platoon called themselves Echo 9, 12 men who became brothers under fire. They joked, they argued, they prayed in the same dirt. Ramirez, the loudest of them all, called Ethan Captain Calm. He said because even when rounds were flying, Ethan never flinched. But courage looks different when you bring it home. In Helmand, courage kept you alive. At home, it was supposed to keep you whole. He left on a cold January morning. Claire stood at the doorway of a small brick house, holding a coffee mug she never drank from. She whispered, "Promise me you'll come back." He smiled that same steady smile she fell in love with and said, stronger than ever. She believed him. She had to. The first year she counted days on the calendar. The second year she stopped counting and started writing letters, even when she didn't know if he'd read them. Every envelope began with the same words, "Just in case this one finds you." Sometimes he'd reply. Sometimes weeks would pass in silence. But every time she saw his handwriting, she'd press the paper to her chest, as if that could bring him closer. Inside the house, his photos never left the walls. One in particular, him and Ramirez, laughing in uniform, stayed above the fireplace. She used to dust it every morning. By the second year, she just stared at it, whispering prayers she wasn't sure anyone was listening to. When he finally came home, nothing in the house had changed, except the man standing in it. The pictures were still there, the metal still shone under the hallway light. But Ethan barely looked at him. He moved like a man walking through a memory that didn't belong to him anymore. At dinner, he nodded when she spoke, but his eyes were somewhere else, fixed on nothing, like he was still waiting for something to move out there in the dark. Claire tried to fill the silence with small talk. "Do you want to go fishing again? Visit your parents this weekend?" He smiled that tired, half-hearted smile and say, "Maybe next time." But next time never came. The first night back, she found him sitting at the edge of the bed, staring in the mirror. The man in the reflection had his face, his scars, his eyes, but none of the warmth she remembered. He ran his hand across the glass and whispered, "It's strange seeing someone else wearing your skin." That was the moment she knew something was wrong. In public, he was polite. He said thank you to everyone who thanked him for his service. He showed up at the veterans' breakfast, shook hands, smiled for pictures. But when the crowd left, he sat in the truck with his hands on the wheel for 10 minutes before driving away. Claire noticed the small things first. The way he'd flinch at a slammed door. The way he scanned every parking lot before getting out of the car. He couldn't stand the sound of fireworks anymore. When she asked him if he was okay, he said it just takes time to readjust. But that word readjust started to feel like a lie. The truth was, he wasn't trying to readjust. He was trying to disappear into the quiet. There was a rhythm to his days. Early morning coffee on the porch, long drives to nowhere, the same walk around the block every evening, always stopping at the same spot, a vacant lot where the street light flickered. Once she followed him. She stayed far enough back not to be seen. He stood under that light for nearly 20 minutes, looking at the sky. His lips moved like he was talking to someone, but no one was there. When he came home, she asked what he was doing out there. He paused and then said softly, "Just checking who's watching over us." She didn't ask again. The days kept passing. His laughter never returned. The old house, once filled with noise, warmth, and music, now echoed with the sound of his boots on the wooden floor and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Sometimes she'd wake to find him sitting by the window,
staring at the streetlight outside. She called his name, but he wouldn't answer right away. And when he finally turned to her, his eyes looked heavy with something she couldn't name, like he was carrying too much to speak. To the world, Ethan Cole was home. To Claire, he was still somewhere far away, halfway between a war that ended and a life that refused to begin again. The thing about coming home is your body arrives first. Your mind takes longer. Ethan Cole's body made it home, but his mind was still out there, somewhere between the desert and the noise. Every night his dreams took him back. Same heat, same smell of diesel and dust, same voices calling over the radio. He could almost taste the air, that metallic dryness you never forget. In his dreams, he wasn't in his bedroom. He was on patrol again. Flash of white light, a sound so sharp it cracks the air. Ramirez shouts, "Move!" And then silence. The kind of silence that doesn't fade. It stays with you. Ethan woke up gasping, heart racing, drenched in sweat. He'd look around the room, searching for something that wasn't there. Then he'd see Claire sleeping beside him, peaceful, untouched by the chaos in his head. And he'd whisper, "You're home. You're home." But the words never felt true, because every night home became a place he couldn't trust. In Helmand, he knew the rules. The ground beneath you could lie, but your brothers wouldn't. Back here, everything lied. The silence, the smiles, even his own reflection. Days were no better. The sound of fireworks on the 4th of July made him hit the floor. The hiss of the coffee maker in the morning sounded too much like the pressure hiss of a shell. Once a car backfired down the street, just once, and he froze mid-step, eyes scanning the horizon like he was back on patrol. Claire saw it happen. She called his name. He blinked, looked around, and gave her a weak smile. "Just thought I heard something." But she could tell it wasn't nothing. At night, he started sleeping on the floor beside the bed. Said it helped his back, but she knew better. The bed was too soft, too still, too safe. He needed the hard ground, the feeling of earth pressing into his shoulder blades to remind himself he was ready. He'd wake at dawn and stand in the doorway, scanning the street like a sentry. To him, the world outside didn't feel peaceful. It felt unguarded, vulnerable. Sometimes he'd whisper coordinates under his breath. Not real ones, just fragments his mind replayed like a broken transmission. Claire would watch from the kitchen, unsure whether to interrupt. One morning she placed her hand on his shoulder and said softly, "You're home now, Ethan." He didn't turn around. "No," he said after a long pause. "Not really." Those 3 words became a pattern, his quiet confession every time she tried to reach him. When he closed his eyes, he saw Ramirez. Ramirez was always laughing, always making noise, even when everyone else stayed quiet. The last time he saw him, they were crouched behind a wall, pinned down by gunfire. Ramirez was hit, but he didn't stop firing. "Go!" he yelled. "Get out of here, Cole!" Ethan hesitated. Ramirez turned, smiling through blood and dust. "Don't you dare freeze up on me now!" Ethan ran. The blast came seconds later. When the dust settled, there was nothing left but silence. He spent hours digging, calling his name, begging into the radio for help that never came in time. Every time Ethan blinked, he saw that wall. Every sound at home, a slamming door, a passing plane, pulled him right back to that moment. He told himself it wasn't his fault. Everyone told him that. But the mind doesn't obey logic when guilt is louder. So he started writing. Not letters to anyone, just pages filled with coordinates, sketches of outposts, lists of names. One of them read, "Ramirez, last seen breathing." Claire found those notes one afternoon. She asked what they were. He said, "Just things I don't want to forget." But she noticed something strange. Every few days he'd burn one of the pages in the backyard, watch the ash drift up, whisper something under his breath, and then walk away, like he was erasing pieces of the past one at a time. His friends tried to visit. Old unit buddies stopped by with beers and laughter. They'd talk about old missions, tell stories, laugh at things only soldiers could find funny. Ethan would smile. He'd even laugh sometimes. But as soon as they left, the smile dropped like a mask slipping off. Claire once asked him why he didn't keep in touch with them more often. He said, "Because when we talk, I remember the ones who aren't here to laugh with us." That was the first time she saw tears in his eyes. She wanted to hug him, but something about the way he sat, shoulders tense, hands gripping his knees, told her he wasn't really in the room. She realized the truth in that moment. Her husband wasn't just haunted by war. He was living in it, replaying it frame by frame every day. The war might have ended on paper, but for Ethan Cole, it never ended at all. And in a small house on the edge of town, every room, every sound, every heartbeat carried the weight of two worlds, the one that cheered for his return and the one that never let him go. It started with a storm, the kind that rolls in slow, deep thunder, the smell of rain on old wood, the flicker of lightning on framed pictures. Claire was reading in bed that night. Ethan sat by the window, staring out at the dark street, a half-empty glass of water trembling in his hand. "You should come to bed," she said softly. He didn't answer. Another flash of light illuminated the room. For a split second, Claire thought she saw the look on his face, the same one she'd seen in old deployment photos. The stare of a man still hearing things no one else could. "It's just thunder, Ethan," she whispered. His breathing slowed, but his eyes didn't move. "That's not thunder," he said quietly. "That's incoming." "Get down," he said, voice sharp now, commanding, the soldier tone she'd only ever heard in fragments. He moved fast, too fast, dragging her from the bed, pressing her against the floor. The lamp fell, shattered. She screamed his name. And just like that, the trance broke. Ethan blinked, eyes darting around the room. The rain against the window replaced the imagined sound of shellfire. He let go of her arm and stumbled back. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I thought—" But she was already crying. That night she slept on the couch. He sat in the hallway until morning, still in the same position, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. From that moment, something inside him shifted. The line between then and now began to blur completely. He stopped going outside, stopped shaving, stopped answering calls. The only thing that stayed constant were the notebooks, the ones filled with sketches and coordinates, names and dates. Each page was more chaotic than the last, scribbled words, smeared ink, torn edges. He was chasing something, but no one knew what. One night he heard him whispering again. This time she recognized the name. "Ramirez," he said softly. "I'm sorry, brother. I shouldn't have left you." His voice cracked, then silence. She stepped closer, but stopped when she saw what he was holding. A folded photo, weathered, sun-faded, of two soldiers smiling in front of a Humvee. Ethan and Ramirez. Claire knelt beside him. "He wouldn't want you to live like this," she said. Ethan looked up, eyes hollow, voice shaking. "That's just it. He doesn't know I am." The storm outside broke fully, rain pounding the windows, wind howling through the open cracks. But inside that house, the real storm was quieter. It was the kind that didn't need sound, the kind that sat in silence, behind trembling hands, and refused to leave. The next morning she found him sitting by the window again, the photo still in his hand. He looked at her with tired eyes and said, "Do you ever feel like you came back to the wrong world?" She didn't know how to answer, because in that moment she realized the man she'd been waiting for all those years was never really coming back. And whatever was left of Ethan Cole, whatever shadow of him remained, was still trapped somewhere far away, replaying a war that would never end. For the first time, she was afraid not of him, but for him. The war ended on paper, but for Ethan Cole, it lived on, quiet, invisible, and waiting. The first weeks after the storm felt like walking through a dream. He moved, he spoke, he breathed, but none of it felt real. Each morning he sat at the kitchen table long after his coffee had gone cold, eyes fixed on nothing. The chair across from him stayed empty. Claire still said it anyway. Sometimes she'd slide a folded note across the table. "Breakfast's ready. Don't forget your appointment today. I love you." He'd read them, but never reply. The silence in the house grew heavier by the day. The photos on the wall, once reminders of joy, now looked like ghosts of a life that belonged to someone else. Claire tried to keep things normal. She played the radio in the mornings. She opened the windows to let light in. She told herself that maybe if she pretended hard enough, things would start to feel like before. But every song reminded him of a convoy. Every breeze through the curtains reminded him of sand. The house had become an outpost. He checked doors twice, sometimes 3 times before bed. Locked windows, measured silence. At night she'd hear him pace in the hallway, bare feet on the wooden floor, slow, deliberate, never stopping. "Ethan," she whispered once, standing at the doorway, "you can rest now." He didn't answer. His eyes were open, but his mind was elsewhere, somewhere far from the safety of their home. The next morning, she found him sitting outside in the cold, staring at the backyard fence. His breath fogged in the early air. His hands were trembling. "Couldn't sleep," he muttered. "You should have woken me." He looked at her, confusion flickering across his face. "I didn't want to scare you." Therapy came and went like clockwork. Dr. Owens, a quiet man with kind eyes, asked the same gentle questions every week. "Do you still hear the explosions, Ethan?" "Not the explosions," Ethan would say. "The quiet after." "The quiet?" "Yeah, when it all stops and you don't know who's still alive." Dr. Owens took notes, nodded, and asked, "Do you think about Ramirez often?" "Every day." "Do you talk to him?" "Sometimes." Claire waited for him in the car after every session. She'd glance up from her hands when he opened the door. "How was it?" "Fine." That was all he'd say. The drive home was always silent. At night, she'd lie awake, listening to the small sounds of his breathing, the ticking clock, the restless shifting in bed. Sometimes he'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling as if something was falling from it. Other times, he'd sit at the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands together, whispering under his breath. Once, I caught a few words. "Ramirez, hold the line. Just hold it." The next morning, he couldn't remember saying anything. "You were talking in your sleep," Claire told him. "Yeah?" "You called out his name." He paused, eyes fixed on the window. "Guess I still owe him an apology." Days bled into nights. Seasons changed outside, but inside, time barely moved. The house aged. The paint cracked. The mail piled up. Neighbors stopped asking how they were doing. Friends stopped visiting. The silence became their only company. Then came July 4th. Claire thought it might help. The fireworks, the celebration, the feeling of being surrounded by people again. She wanted to remind him what home was supposed to feel like. They sat on the blanket under the night sky. For a while he smiled. He even laughed when a kid spilled popcorn near their feet. She felt something stir inside her. Hope. But then the fireworks began. The first few were soft bursts of red and gold that lit the faces of children and families. Then one exploded louder than the rest. Ethan's body tensed, his breathing hitched. Another blast, deeper, longer. The sound turned into something else. Gunfire. Mortars. The world shifted for him in an instant. He dropped to the ground, eyes wide, scanning the horizon. "Ethan!" she shouted, grabbing his arm. "It's just fireworks. You're safe." But he couldn't hear her. He was somewhere else entirely. "Ramirez, move! Move!" he yelled, voice cracking. People around them turned. A mother covered her child's ears. Claire held him tightly, whispering, "You're home. You're safe." After what felt like hours, he stopped shaking. His eyes found hers, vacant, lost. She guided him back to the car. They drove home in silence.
When they reached the house, he sat in the driveway, staring straight ahead. "It felt so real," he said quietly. "The sand, the sound, the heat, like it never ended." She wanted to tell him it was over, but she knew he wouldn't believe her. That night, she wrote a letter. She didn't know if he'd ever read it. Maybe she just needed to write it. "Ethan," she wrote, "I keep looking for you in the spaces between silence. I see your body here, but your soul feels miles away. Every day I fight a war I never enlisted for, trying to bring you home from a place I can't reach." She folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it in the box with his medals. It stayed there, unopened. As weeks passed, Ethan withdrew further. He stopped answering calls. He disconnected the doorbell. The TV became his only companion, not for the shows, but for the sound. He'd sit close to it, the flicker of light washing over his face, eyes vacant, as if the static might drown out the echoes in his head. Sometimes she'd find him asleep on the floor, fingers clenched around the photo of Ramirez. "You miss him?" she said softly once. Ethan nodded. "He saved me." "He'd want you to live." "That's what makes it worse." The therapy sessions grew less frequent. The medications piled up. "It's getting harder," he admitted to Dr. Owens one afternoon. "What is?" "Knowing which memories are real. And when that happens, what do you do?" "I write. I talk to him." "Ramirez?" Ethan nodded slowly. "He listens, more than most people do." Back home, Claire sat by the window, writing in her journal. "Every day feels like losing him in pieces," she wrote. "First his smile, then his voice, then the way he used to look at me. Now it's just silence, and the man I love fighting ghosts I can't see." She closed the book, placed her head against the glass, and whispered to no one, "Would you have waited if love started to feel like loss?" Outside, the rain began to fall. Inside, Ethan sat at the kitchen table again, tracing the edge of his medal with his thumb, the one Ramirez never lived to receive. His reflection in the glass was faint, blurred, almost like he wasn't there at all. And in that quiet room, for just a moment, he almost believed he wasn't. That night, the rain began before sunset. A low hum at first, soft, steady, harmless. Ethan sat by the window, hands clasped, staring at nothing in particular. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made his chest ache. Claire had gone to bed hours ago, but he stayed awake, listening. The storm outside grew heavier, and with each rumble, something inside him shifted. He'd spent months pretending that everything was fine, pretending that dinner conversations could drown out the echoes of gunfire, that laughter could erase the sound of Ramirez's voice calling out in the dust. But that night, he couldn't pretend anymore. The thunder cracked loud, sharp, sudden, and in an instant, he was no longer in his living room. He was back there, back in the heat, back in the sand. The smell of diesel filled his nose, the ringing in his ears returned, the screams, the orders, the chaos. He stood up slowly, heart pounding.
His hands trembled as he reached for the small wooden chest by the wall. Inside was everything he had tried to forget. His uniform, a faded photograph, the dog tag that wasn't his, and beneath it all, the rifle. He didn't remember loading it. He didn't remember standing in the hallway whispering to men who weren't there anymore. He only remembered the fear, that same primal fear from the day Ramirez died. He called out names that no longer had faces. He gave orders to men buried halfway across the world. His voice shook with desperation. "Stay low. We're not losing anyone else. Not tonight." Claire woke to the sound of his voice. She found the door locked, his shadow moving behind it. Her heart pounded as she whispered his name. "Ethan, please, it's just the storm." But to him, the storm wasn't rain. It was artillery. It was the sound of everything he'd failed to save. He pressed his back to the wall, breathing fast. "They're here," he said under his breath. Ramirez is down. We can't leave him." Her tears came quietly. "Ethan, listen to me. You're home. You're safe. There's no one here but me." He didn't answer. He could still hear the explosion, the one that took Ramirez, the one that left him breathing when his friend wasn't. He saw it again. The dust, the light, the silence that followed. The sound of a heartbeat that wasn't his. He dropped the rifle. The sound of metal hitting the floor pulled him back. He froze half in the past, half in the present, shaken, gasping for air. Claire pushed the door open and saw him there on his knees, eyes wide, tears falling freely. He looked up at her and said, almost to himself, "It should have been me." She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his face. He flinched at first, then collapsed into her arms, sobbing like a man who had held it in too long. Claire said nothing. She just held him. Her tears mixed with his, her hand resting gently on his head. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, before he finally spoke again, his voice hoarse. "I saw him, Claire. Every time I close my eyes, he's still there, waiting for me." She whispered softly, "He'd want you here. He'd want you to live." He shook his head. "I left him. I left him to die." Her reply came through broken breaths. "You didn't leave him. You survived for him." The storm outside began to fade, the thunder rolling further away. The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was fragile, almost peaceful. He sat there, his head against her shoulder, whispering the same name again and again. Ramirez, the name that had haunted his dreams. When he finally looked up, his face was pale, his eyes red. But for the first time in years, there was something human in him, something alive. He whispered, "I'm sorry." Claire's voice was barely audible. "He forgave you a long time ago." They sat together until morning. No words, no promises, just two broken people trying to remember what it felt like to breathe. The rain stopped. The world outside felt still, untouched, as if holding its breath for him. He stared at the light creeping through the curtains, whispering to no one in particular, "I came home, but I don't know how to stay." That night didn't fix him. It didn't erase the ghosts or silence the memories. But for the first time since the war, Ethan Cole spoke. And the words he spoke weren't orders or regrets. They were confessions. They were the truth. And though they weren't meant for Claire, she listened anyway. Because sometimes the only way to heal a wound that deep is to let someone else carry part of it. The morning after the storm was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air is holding its breath. Ethan sat by the window again, eyes fixed on the horizon. Claire watched him from the doorway, afraid to speak, afraid that any sound might shatter the fragile calm that had finally settled over them. For the first time in months, he looked different. Not healed, not whole, but softer, like a man who had finally laid down his weapon, even if just for a while. He started going out during the day, walking alone, sitting in the park, watching strangers laugh and live. The noise of the city was still too much sometimes, but he stayed. He stayed long enough to watch kids ride their bikes, long enough to hear the sound of people existing without fear. Claire noticed the small changes first, the way he'd pause before flinching when a car backfired, the way he'd linger in conversations a little longer before drifting away, the way his eyes, once empty, now flickered with something faintly resembling light. He began therapy. The first few sessions were quiet, just long silences and short answers. The doctor asked about the war, and Ethan would stare at the wall, saying nothing. Then one day he spoke. He talked about Ramirez, about the laughter they shared in the desert, the jokes that made the heat bearable, the promise they made that they'd both come home. One of them did, the other didn't. The words came slowly, but once they started, they didn't stop. He talked about guilt like it was a living thing, something that followed him from sunrise to sunset. He said it lived in his chest, right beside the memory of the man who saved his life. The therapist asked him what he wanted most. Ethan said, to sleep without seeing their faces. He joined a support group for veterans. They sat in a circle, men and women from different wars, all carrying the same invisible scars. He didn't speak much at first, just listened. One of them said, sometimes healing isn't moving on, it's learning to carry it better. That line stayed with him. He started volunteering at the local VA center, helping new veterans adjust to civilian life. He didn't see himself as a savior. He just wanted to listen, the way someone once listened to him. At night, he'd sit with Claire and tell her about the people he met, the ones still fighting the war long after it ended, the ones who, like him, had survived but hadn't really come back. For a while, it seemed like things were getting better, until the morning he was gone.
Claire woke to sunlight spilling through the curtains. The bed beside her was empty. His boots were gone, his jacket too. She thought he'd gone for his usual walk until she saw the envelope on the table. Her name was written on it in his handwriting. Steady, careful, deliberate. She sat down, heart pounding, and unfolded the paper. The note read, Claire, I've tried to make this place home again. I really have. You've given me more patience than I deserve, more love than I could return. But the truth is, I came home, and they didn't. Every morning, I hear them. Every night, I see them. Ramirez once told me, if you make it back, live enough for both of us. I tried, Claire. God knows I tried. But I can't find peace here. So I'm going to where I left them. Not to die, but to finally rest. Don't wait for me. Just remember me the way I was before the war. Before everything changed. Tell my mom I'm okay. Tell Ramirez's family I never forgot him. Ethan. Claire read it over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. She didn't scream. She didn't cry, not at first. She just sat there, holding the letter to her chest, as if the paper itself could bring him back. Hours passed before she called anyone. By the time the police arrived, his truck was already gone. They searched the woods near the old military base, the lake he used to visit, the memorial grounds where his unit's names were carved in stone. No one found him that day. Not the next either. Days turned to weeks. The search quieted. The world moved on. But Claire never stopped hoping. She'd leave the porch light on every night, just in case he ever found his way back. Sometimes she'd walk by the lake and swear she heard footsteps behind her, soft, familiar, fading away before she could turn around. The veterans from his group built a small plaque for him at the memorial. It sat beside Ramirez's too, named side by side again. And at the annual remembrance ceremony, the chaplain read Ethan's note aloud to the crowd. When he finished, the silence that followed was heavy. No one clapped, no one spoke. They just stood there, listening to the wind. It was as if the story had come full circle. The soldier who came home but never returned, finally finding his way back to the only place that still felt like peace. Years passed. The house that once echoed with the weight of silence became something gentler. The walls no longer held the same pain, though traces of him still lingered in the smell of old coffee, in the sound of the porch step that always creaked beneath his boots, in the folded flag that sat quietly above the fireplace. Claire grew older, but she never remarried. People often asked her why, and she'd always smile, the kind of smile that hides more than it shows, and say, I already had the love of my life. The rest of my heart stayed with him. Every year on the same date, she'd visit the memorial. She never missed a single one. She'd bring fresh flowers, always white, and placed them beneath the bronze plaques where Ethan's name sat beside Ramirez's. Sometimes she'd talk to him, softly, like he was sitting right there beside her. Other times she'd just sit in silence, letting the breeze carry her words for her. Her voice now older, gentle, but steady. People ask me if he ever came back, and I tell them, in a way, he did. Every veteran he helped, every story he shared before he left, that's where he lives now. She spoke of the veterans who still gathered in that same room he once sat in, the ones who came broken, searching for someone who could understand, and how in that room they still told stories about him, about the soldier who never gave up on them, even when he'd already given up on himself. They'd talk about how he listened without judgment, how he'd stay long after the meetings ended just to make sure no one walked home alone. One of them said, he didn't talk much, but when he did, you felt safe. Another added, he taught me that surviving doesn't mean forgetting. Those words spread. Through them, his name began to carry meaning again, not as a ghost, but as a quiet kind of hope. Years later, the support center hung a photograph of Ethan and Ramirez on the wall. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "For those who came home, and for those who never really did." It became a place of reflection, where new veterans would come to sit in silence, to think, to breathe. Claire visited often, watching from a distance as they traced his name with their fingers, whispering their own stories into the stillness. Sometimes she'd reread his note, not with sadness, but with a quiet understanding. She had come to realize it wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise. A man who couldn't live for himself had somehow found a way to live on through others. She began to write short pieces about soldiers, love, loss, and homecoming. Her stories were published in a small local paper under the name C. Cole. Readers didn't know who she was, but her words resonated. Some wrote back saying her stories helped them forgive someone they'd lost, or themselves. She never told them that every line she wrote was in truth a letter to Ethan. One spring morning, many years later, a young veteran visited her. He had served in the same division as Ethan once had. He brought with him a folded letter, one Ethan had written years ago, but never sent. The soldier said it was found inside a supply crate during a restoration of the old base in Helmand. The letter was simple, no fancy words, just truth. If you're reading this, it means I made it home. Maybe not all of me, but enough to keep trying. War teaches you how to fight. Love teaches you why. If I ever forget who I am, remind me I was someone once worth coming home to. Claire read it with trembling hands. Tears fell silently, not from pain, but peace. She placed the letter beside the one he'd left her years ago, two pieces of the same story, finally side by side. As the years faded, Claire spent her days tending the small garden he once built behind the house. The old chair he used to sit in remained by the window, the same one from the night he first came home. She never moved it. Every morning, sunlight would find its way there, hitting the same spot on the worn fabric. She often found herself staring at that empty chair, whispering, "You did come home, Ethan. Maybe not in the way we imagined, but you came back in every life you touched." And in the quiet that followed, she swore she could almost hear him, that same low cackle, the one that used to fill their kitchen before the war. The garden sways in the wind, white flowers nodding in rhythm, sunlight stretching across the wooden porch. The house feels quieter now, but not lonely. It carries stories in its walls, whispers of laughter, echoes of memory, and the heartbeat of a love that refused to die with distance or war or time. A soft breeze passes through the open window, brushing gently against the old chair by the light. Dust motes dance like fireflies in the air, and for a fleeting second, the shadow of a man seems to rest there still, peaceful, smiling. Claire murmurs, "Faint, filled with both weight and warmth. Sometimes people ask me why I still tell his story, and I tell them because somewhere out there, someone's waiting for their soldier to come home too. And maybe hearing his story will remind them they're not alone. She continues, staring over soft images of folded letters, medals, hands holding photographs, a veteran walking with his daughter across a parade ground. We all fight our own wars. Some are fought overseas, others right here inside of us. But the truth is, home isn't a place. It's the people who wait, who love, who remember. And maybe, just maybe, that's where we all find peace.
If this story moved you, share it. Somewhere, someone needs to hear it. And if you believe every soldier's journey deserves to be remembered, stay with us. Subscribe for more real stories of courage, loss, and homecoming.